I was just wondering why the government don't take more focus on creating news hubs that is more natural in that have no stakeholders in what they communicate. For instance, the Al Jazeera has grown up as a balance between the American point of news. We lived in the US in the early 90s, and we had very hard to get any news about Europe at all, because we only watch the CNN US version. So as a citizen, you have very few actually sources to go to that is real. So thanks for NRK in many ways, because I feel they don't have so many stakeholders to protect or to gain. I know that I heard yesterday that Sweden is now thinking of going over to a tax.
Media tax, yeah.
Instead of a voluntarily
they are not licensed anymore, but proposing a tax, yeah.
Which is good, which is good. So sort of as a government, why don't they sort of help and establish some hubs that is neutral?
In the US. In the US, you mean?
In any countries.
So, well, in the U.S., I think mentioning tax whenever, in any sentence at any time is an immediate way to shut down the conversation. I mean, part of the problem, right, there is a big difference here about these sorts of things. And, the other issue here, in the U.S., things have gotten to a point where, look, even the idea of fact-checking, right? There's been studies work done on this. People in the U.S., I can't speak to other, you would know, but fact-checking is viewed with suspicion, particularly on the right. The data shows that if you lean Republican or you are, let alone being highly conservative, people like Dan Kahan have shown that you're going to be much more suspicious of the very idea of fact-checking. So the attempts in the U.S. by independent sources, not the government, but by independent sources like PolitiFact and Snopes and Poynter, have been now very controversial. People think that if you cite fact-checking sources, you're immediately identifying yourself as some, sort of Norway-loving, liberal, progressive, that sort of thing, right? And
the worst of the worst.
Oh, the worst. Oh, the worst. Yeah. And I self-identify. So I think for us, we've got to start at a level of values. I think trying to rediscover a narrative that recaptures some of the values that would allow us to have those sorts of conversations. And I know that sounds, in a sense you think, really? We got to start with values? That's a big boulder to roll up a hill. But yeah, I think we've got to admit that that's where we've got to start.
Thank you. Yeah.
I agree with all of that, but I'm going to make some... Exactly. So, if there's any society that's been more committed to knowledge generation than the United States, I'm willing to hear nominations. But you have state-supported universities on a per capita basis far beyond any other in the world. After World War II was the GI Bill, which gave every male served, free education through college. You still have National Public Radio and National Public TV, which is not entirely funded by the federal government. Mostly not, but it's great that they sustained it for as long as they did, and then provided a ramp down so they could generate other sources of funding. The internet is the result of the Department of Defense. This was actually renamed, by the way. It used to be called the Department of War when the United States was thoroughly isolationist. But then when it got international, and then it became the Department of Defense. So someone mentioned Orwell, I think here.
There's some fake news for you.
Yeah, but the Politics of Language essay is a must read. So as Kant pointed out, war itself is a profoundly progressive fact. It changes the world in ways that generally make it better. And while that sounds like a horrifying observation to make, he was right, and any of us can give you examples of that. For example, just to add, the women's movement begins with World War II in the United States. The civil rights movement in the United States begins with World War II. Beyond that, one has the National Institutes of Health, one has an amazing amount of funding to generate knowledge. All that is said, it is true that some of the public is deeply suspicious of news of the style that we're talking about. But those people weren't particularly enthusiastic about news before that anyway, because they're generally rural, they're generally perceiving their world being transformed in ways they do not like. And the more news they would consume is telling them about the fact of those changes. And whether it's called fake news or they become news non-consumers. So there's actually rather less that's dramatic. I return to the point I made earlier. There's more news, it's cheaper, it's faster, and one gets better information because you get visual and not just textual reports as they go along.
I'm just taking the question there, and you will have the chance after, please.
I think there's one thing that I would like to have more emphasis, and that is the consensus, the agreement, and that is also of what is not discussed. Here, close to the polar circle, we have a herd of pink elephants that are always in rooms like this. So is that a concept you use in America too? Pink elephants in the room? Yeah. Is it international or is it local?
The color is different, I think, but the animal still's there.
Yeah. And so it's what we agree not to talk about, which is very much part of the not news. And I think when you talk about the boulders of values, I think it's a continuous thing. And one of the things that I miss is the value of talking about the elephants. And that's very contaminating. And I mean, in Copernicus' time, it's not so many centuries ago, everybody agreed the Earth was in the center of the universe. And we should leave that consensus. We haven't left it quite yet. So,
in my country, there's a lot of people who still believe that, I think. This is where maybe George and I disagree on some things. But I mean, just real quick on that, I think the value of evidence and understanding the value of evidence and seeing the role that it plays or should play in our democracy is absolutely crucial. The concept of evidence is something that I think we have, some of us anyway, are increasingly have a distorted relationship to it. That is that we often are, and part of this, as George's work actually, in well-known work shows, we have a human tendency to sort of look critically at evidence that displeases us and uncritically at evidence that pleases us. And that's a sort of bad faith. But look, I think what's left unsaid is always an important feature of it's the evidence that we don't pay attention to that is absolutely crucial. And you're right, that's part of, in a sense, information pollution. What's not put in but left out. And there maybe the metaphor breaks down.
Yeah, I think. Per, you gave us the hope in your last when you last had the microphone, but now you wanted to say some more.
Building on the elephant discourse, considering that media coverage is in its nature very selective, I think the difference is if you in a society believe that the elephants that are left out because there has been applied a sense of a neutral consideration, that there has been a journalistic process in which you select which elephants to elevate and put on TV and in the newspapers, and which you leave on the ground. And in societies where you believe that the most important elephants are not put on television and are not talked about, and that is a deliberate political action deciding. So this is not a very original insight, but something interesting about Donald Trump was how he was quite honest on his own shortcomings. It was quite evident that he was quite corrupt, and that he was a sexist and borderline racist, and that he also was very much yes, and also was susceptible for financial to be påvirket, impacted, exactly, influenced. But in a way that appeared credible in a society where a large segment of the population believes that everyone are corrupt. Therefore, open corruption appears in a way honest, because at least he's showing us the process in which elephants are elevated and others are left down. So, yes, it's about faith in the process of which elephants are elevated and which are left in the dark.
We are about to wrap up. Yeah, there's a question there and there. Make them brief.
Maybe it's a bit optimistic to be brief about it, but in the sense that, or to the extent that this openness about your own shortcomings and his sort of constant nagging about how bad he can be, and that he's open about it, do you think that's in a way making us care less about people doing bad stuff, like the way he's open about it? Or do you think it encourages people, the way that you're talking about, to be a better person? In general, would you say that it's making us care less and just turning a blind eye, or is it making us work harder to sort of counter this movement?
An obvious yes or no question for the philosopher, I think.
Okay. I think yes and no.
Okay.
Philosopher, I mean, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Always yes and no.
Difficult. Yeah.
You want me to say more?
No, it's fine.
I didn't think so.
I think it's an interesting
I've said
reflection.
enough.
Yeah, please.
I just have a question. Isn't some of the this might have been discussed earlier today, but isn't some of the problem here that people, for good or bad, or correctly or wrongly, are more and more viewing what was considered the mainstream also to be politically biased, in the sense that, I mean, for instance, in Norway, many people are now critical against the NRK for what they see as its view on immigration. And others, for instance myself, I tend to stay away from NRK if I want news from the Middle East, because I view it as comment, not as journalism, basically. So doesn't we have to, if we are going to regain confidence in the mainstream, have to take this into consideration as well? That it has to be more, well, balanced than we have sort of gotten away with before. Just some rambling from me.
Well, yeah, Gunn, please.
Yes, a very good question, and I think that you're right. There are a problem now with or a legitimacy crisis in some of the mainstream media, and that has to do with not fake news. Maybe we could say pollution, but it's mostly about the suspicion of bias, where you don't trust the journalist to represent your view or to be neutral. You think of this news reporting as somewhat often more liberal or more to the left, perhaps, because much criticism now comes from the right parts of the political spectrum. So we see that, for example, the NRK has been accused of being the Labour Party's broadcasting, the ARK, and this is a problematic situation because it doesn't only go regarding to the news media, but to the news, but also the talk shows like Nytt på Nytt and other also entertainment programs. So these discussions are healthy. I think it's good that we discuss it, but also in the sense that when we use things as fact checking as a kind of a source to help these news institutions like the NRK to be kind of checked again whether or not they are telling the truth. I don't think that really helps, because I think if you distrust the media, the mainstream media, if you suspect that there are a bias reporting, then you would also suspect that the fact-checking is biased, and that this is a top-down also mechanism where you feel that this is not relevant for me. You could say, you can tell me 1,000 times that this is the facts and that the NRK are presenting the news correctly, but I don't really believe it, because I think that they actually are biased. And so this is something that previously there has also been criticism of the media from the other side. The right wing has been criticizing the media for being capitalist, imperialistic, not giving voices to different views in wars, for example. So they are, but I think both of those criticisms have some elements that should be taken into consideration. It's not like I think also Trump's use of fake news, it has some resonance in the public, and we need to take that serious as well, and not only accuse him of being silly.
No, I am about to wrap up, but I would like to finish with a question for Tuva, because we started with you. I think if we have moved the world in this panel today, I think we have succeeded in isolating the US, putting the problem there, and also putting some responsibility to the political system, I think. But we have also introduced insecurity, and much of this is about insecurity. And my question to you is that, do you think that you can trust in the media, trust in your Instagram feed then, or is it okay to live with a certain amount of insecurity and thinking that it might be right, it might be wrong?
Well, it's kind of difficult. I think that it's better to be a little bit on your toes, maybe, and not believe in everything you read. That's what I've been taught through my whole life, that I need to take everything that I read on the internet with a pinch of salt. It's probably not good to always be on your toes and always be insecure about if it's maybe right or if it's not. But if you check the sources and the facts, then you're not concerned if it's right or wrong anymore. So I think it's better to be safe that it's right than being like, it's maybe right. Yeah.
Check it out.
Yeah. Always check your sources.
Yeah, thank you. That was a good final line, I think. Thank you very much. Thank you to the audience. Thank you very much.